All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to be really getting into a pretty big challenge in agriculture these days. It's something that, it affects all of us really, and that's how pests are becoming increasingly resistant to the chemicals that we use to manage them. The stuff that we use in IPM.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? It's interesting because you sent over a report to me, and it really kind of digs into this whole problem. How one of the major agrochemical companies is dealing with this whole issue.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, we want to make sure that we're not, giving you too much information at once. So we're going to try to break this down and make it as understandable as possible. But we are going to be going pretty deep, into this whole idea of pest resistance
Yeah.
and what are some of the things that they're doing about it. So today our goal is really just to help you understand this whole area a lot better.
And it's really important to understand the context here, right? Because we're talking about the global IPM market, which is expected to be worth something like $20.1 billion this year in 2024. And that's projected to grow to $32.1 billion by 2031.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a huge market, and it's growing at a pretty healthy rate, like almost 6% annually. So when you think about the importance of effective test management, to our food supply and just to the economy in general, it's huge.
Yeah. And so let's get right to it then. This report it highlights that pests are developing this, increasing resistance to the conventional agrochemicals that we're using, and these are the very things that form the foundation of IPM. So it's a serious concern.
Right. Yeah. And what's really fascinating here is that there's this kind of like domino effect, right? So when pests develop this resistance, it means that the products that the agrochemical manufacturers are making, they just don't work as well.
Right.
And so farmers are forced to either use more of the product or they have to spray more frequently, which obviously leads to higher costs.
And that obviously has a direct impact on their bottom line, right? So the report, it makes it clear that when those products aren't as effective, you get lower crop yields, which obviously directly impacts the manufacturer's profitability and how competitive they are in the market.
Yeah. And then you've got to, factor in the cost of developing new agrochemicals, right? I mean, this is not a quick or easy process.
Oh, of course not.
I mean, it takes years of research, and then you've got all the regulatory hurdles to jump through. So it's a really expensive and time-consuming process.
So, I mean, it puts them in a really tough spot. They're dealing with customers, farmers who are seeing these pest problems even though they're using these products. And that's going to lead to dissatisfaction and potentially losing those customers, losing market share.
Yeah, exactly. And when we zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture, this is not just a business problem, right? This is actually a threat to the sustainability of IPM because, remember, IPM is all about using a combination of methods, both chemical and non-chemical. And if one of those tools, the chemical tool, starts to fail, the whole system is weakened.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. And especially when you consider, the global demand for food is just growing and growing. You need effective agrochemicals for sustainable agriculture. So what's the way forward? So this report that we're talking about, it actually goes into how this company, Cognitive Market Research, how they actually stepped in to help this major agrochemical manufacturer.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is, how they approached it. So they had this very data-centric approach, right? They didn't just come in with some, generic advice. They really wanted to understand the problem. So they did a deep dive into the market, into the science behind this resistance. They really wanted to understand, the extent of it and the patterns, how it was developing.
So what did that actually look like? I mean, the report mentions a multi-phase research methodology. What does that mean exactly?
So the first phase was all about gathering information, right? So they looked at all the available data, things like scientific studies, agricultural databases, and importantly, they analyzed the manufacturer's own data from their field trials. So, they had all this information about where and how this resistance was emerging.
So it wasn't just like, focusing on one specific pest in one area.
No. They were looking at the big picture. And they actually partnered with agricultural research institutions, and they conducted, pretty extensive field trials. And all of this was to create what they called a comprehensive map of insect resistance levels across different regions.
Okay. So they were able to actually, pinpoint where those hot spots were, where the resistance was the most severe, and where those current products were. We're just not cutting it.
Yeah, exactly. And, once they had this map, they could start to prioritize, where they needed to focus their research and development efforts. And the report also mentions that they use something called GIS, Geographic Information System technology. And this was really cool. They actually created these visual representations, almost like a heat map of these resistance levels, across agricultural zones, so they could see how it was distributed geographically.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It was like this, powerful visual tool that helped them, really understand the problem and make more informed decisions.
So it wasn't just about location, though, right? I mean, the report also mentions cluster analysis. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so think of cluster analysis like sorting laundry, right?
Yeah.
You group similar colors together so you can wash them effectively. So here they were grouping together areas that had similar patterns of pest resistance. And, by doing that, they could start to understand, what are the underlying factors that might be contributing to resistance in certain regions or with certain pest populations. And then they could, develop more targeted solutions.
So it's about finding those common threads, in the resistance data, and then they also did a gap analysis of the client's existing product line, right?
Yes, absolutely. So they really took a hard look at all the products that the client was currently selling. They compared it to what their competitors were offering, and they really evaluated how well those products were performing against these resistant pests. And this really helped them to identify where the client's products were underperforming and where there was a need for new products to be developed.
Okay, so they really did their homework, right? They really diagnosed the problem using data. And what were the results of all this? I mean, the report, it mentioned some pretty impressive numbers.
Yeah, it really does. So they were able to reduce the inefficient use of agrochemicals by about 20%. In the areas that were most affected by resistance.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's a significant reduction, right? I mean, it's good for the environment, it's good for farmers, for their bottom line, and then they also saw some pretty impressive improvements in crop yields. So in the first year of implementing these new strategies, they saw about a 12% increase in crop yields in those targeted regions.
Oh, wow. And that's a direct benefit to the farmers, right?
Absolutely, and on top of that, they also saw about a 15% improvement in overall pest management effectiveness in that first year. So, it's clear that these tailored strategies were really making a difference.
Yeah. And then for the agrochemical manufacturer itself, I mean, did they see any financial benefits?
Yeah, actually, they saw a pretty substantial reduction in their operating expenses.
Mm.
So because they were able to, target their research and development efforts more effectively, they actually managed to decrease their operating expenses by about 10%.
Wow. So it really is a win-win-win situation. It's good for the environment, it's good for the farmers, and it's good for the company. So based on all of this understanding that they gained, what were some of the key strategic recommendations that cognitive market research made to their client?
Well, the first one was to diversify their product portfolio.
Hmm.
The resistance mapping had shown them where their current products were falling short. So, the advice was to broaden their offerings,
Hmm.
to offer more products that could, address these different resistance challenges.
Right. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Exactly. And
Right.
and then, they also identified some specific gaps in their product line. So they pointed out areas where there was a lack of effective solutions against certain resistant pests, and so the recommendation there was to develop new, more targeted agrochemicals that were specifically designed to combat these problem pests.
And it wasn't just about, creating new chemicals, right?
Yeah.
The report also talks about the importance of incorporating alternative pest management strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really important point because, they recognize that relying solely on traditional agrochemicals was not a sustainable solution.
Yeah.
And so they recommended that the client should start to integrate biological control agents into their IPM solutions. And, this can involve things like introducing beneficial insects, that naturally prey on pests, or they could use naturally occurring microorganisms that disrupt pest life cycles.
So it's a more holistic approach to IPM, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And by combining these alternative methods with the conventional chemicals, you basically reduce the pressure on pests to develop resistance to any one type of control. And that's really the key, right? It's about creating a more complex environment for the pest, making it harder for them to adapt.
Right, right. So it's like, you're hitting them from all angles.
Exactly. And the report actually suggests that this integration of different methods can actually help to slow down the development of resistance and essentially restore the effectiveness of the overall IPM strategy.
That's great. And then the report also mentions, using market forecasts and consumer behavior analysis. So how did those factors play into the recommendations?
Well, it was all about making sure that any new products that they developed would actually meet the real world needs of the market.
Yeah.
So by understanding, future trends in agriculture and what farmers are actually looking for, they could make sure that they were developing products that would be, readily adopted and effective in the long run.
Right, right. And they also suggested that they form strategic partnerships, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, they recommended that the clients should collaborate with biotech companies and agricultural research institutions. And this was really about, speeding up the development and implementation of these innovative solutions. It's about leveraging, external expertise and resources to bring new tools to the market more efficiently.
Okay, that makes sense. So after the client, put these recommendations into action, what were the benefits for them?
Well, the report, it says that they saw significant improvements in their product effectiveness,
Yeah.
which obviously strengthened their market position. And, the introduction of those new biological control agents and the new agrochemicals,
Yeah.
they really helped to reduce insect resistance in those key regions that they had identified through the analysis.
Yeah, and that obviously leads to better outcomes for the farmers, which ultimately benefits the manufacturer.
Exactly. So, with more effective IPM strategies, farmers were seeing increased crop yields. And this is really important. They were more satisfied, with the products that they were using. And that, leads to customer loyalty and obviously higher profitability for the client.
And the report also mentions that they were able to create new market segments. How did that happen?
Yeah, so by diversifying their product portfolio, particularly by offering those more sustainable and effective biological control solutions, they were able to tap into a new market,
Yeah.
right? So there was a growing segment of farmers who were increasingly looking for greener pest control options,
Hmm.
and so by offering those types of products, they were able to expand their market reach.
Right, and the partnerships that they formed, they also had a lasting impact, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So by working with these biotech companies and research institutions, they were able to position themselves as a leader in the development of next generation agrochemicals. And so this not only helped them to accelerate their current research and development efforts, but it also set them up for continued innovation in the future.
And having that strategic foresight from the market forecast, I mean, that was also a big advantage, right?
Yeah, definitely. So by being able to anticipate future market demands and understanding how consumer preferences were changing, they could really stay ahead of the curve. They could adapt their strategies, they could develop new products that would meet those future needs. And that's really, key to being competitive in the long run.
And all of that led to new opportunities for them to expand globally, right?
Exactly. So, with a stronger product portfolio, a better reputation for innovation, they were in a really good position to explore new markets around the world.
So really what we're seeing here is that this intervention by cognitive market research, it didn't just help this client to, overcome this challenge of pest resistance. It actually helped them to thrive, in this growing IPM market. And as we said at the beginning, that market is expected to grow by billions of dollars in the coming years. So that the analysis, the recommendations, they weren't just about, fixing a problem. They were about seizing an opportunity and really establishing themselves as a leader in this field of integrated pest management.
And I think that's a really important takeaway, right? I mean, it shows how a data-driven approach can really transform a challenge into into an opportunity, especially in a critical industry like agriculture.
Absolutely. So just to recap, we've seen how this growing challenge of pest resistance, it requires a proactive and a data-driven approach. And this example that we've been talking about today, it really gives us a glimpse into the future of IPM, and the vital role of innovation in ensuring its success.
And that brings us to a question for you, our listener.
Yeah.
Given how quickly pest resistance can evolve, what other innovative solutions do you think might be needed in the future? Especially those non-chemical solutions. What do we need to do to ensure global food security and environmental sustainability? It's something to think about.
Definitely. So thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.
See you next time.